At 3:17 in the morning, somewhere in the northern Caribbean Sea, the surface of the water looked almost unreal in its stillness. There was no moonlight spilling across the waves, no trail of distant ships, no obvious sign that anything unusual was happening. From the flight deck of the USS George Washington, it seemed like another quiet night of routine transit. A massive carrier moved steadily through the dark water, its escort ships holding formation, its radar picture clean, predictable, and calm. But the ocean has a way of hiding its most important signals beneath the surface. Deep inside the carrier's operation spaces, the atmosphere was very different. The soft hum of electronics filled the room. Screens glowed in green and amber tones. Watch teams studied streams of information coming from sensors across the strike group. Most of it was normal. Background ocean noise, distant commercial traffic, shifting thermal layers, and the ordinary patterns that experienced operators learned to filter out. Then one trace stopped behaving like everything else. At first, it did not look dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no obvious challenge, no loud signature. It was just a faint, persistent acoustic contact sitting near the edge of the carrier strike group's passive detection range. Too slow to be normal surface traffic, too steady to be marine life, too deliberate to be ignored. It did not announce itself. It did not rush forward. It did not transmit. It simply held depth and moved with quiet patience, slowly becoming part of the picture. On the sonar plot, the line barely shifted, and that was exactly what made it interesting. In the undersea world, movement tells a story. Currents push objects. Machines create patterns. Even cautious submarines drift, correct, and reveal tiny traces of behavior. But this contact adjusted just enough to stay in relation to the strike group. It was not closing quickly. It was not falling behind. It was matching. That single detail changed the mood. There were no loud alarms, no dramatic announcements across the ship, no sudden rush of activity visible to anyone outside the watch spaces. Instead, the change was quiet and professional. Senior watch officers leaned closer to the displays. Analysts began comparing the contact's movement against the carrier's course. Every bearing shift mattered now. Every faint change in sound had meaning. For the moment, passive listening remained the only option. No active sonar pulses were authorized. Not yet. Sending out an active signal would not only reveal that the contact had been found, it would also show posture, capability, and intent to anyone else listening in the region. And in waters like these, it is never safe to assume that only one side is listening. The strike group was operating legally in international waters. There was no visible provocation, no public exercise, no dramatic show of force. But beneath the surface, intent is rarely spoken directly. It is understood through timing, angle, distance, and silence. And this contact was very silent. There was no obvious machinery pattern from a surface vessel, no irregular acoustic scatter typical of civilian underwater vehicles, no uncontrolled noise. This was careful silence, controlled silence, the kind that suggested training. Within minutes, analysts began narrowing the possibilities. The acoustic profile matched what might be expected from a diesel-electric submarine operating on battery power. That matters because battery operation is one of the quietest ways for such a platform to move. It is not built for endless endurance. It is built for patience, concealment, and timing. That detail made the situation sharper. A diesel-electric submarine does not spend quiet battery time casually. Every minute submerged without refreshing air and power is a choice. Every mile traveled in that state is part of a calculation. So if this contact was here, holding position near a carrier strike group, it was unlikely to be accidental. The geometry supported that conclusion. The contact was not blindly crossing the carrier's path. It was not drifting into the wake. It was angling toward the outer defensive structure of the group, close enough to observe, but not so close that the situation would automatically become something else. It was the kind of move that sits in the gray area, bold enough to send a message, careful enough to deny one. Inside the command spaces, the mood shifted from curiosity to focus. No one panicked. No one needed to. The U.S. Navy trains for moments like this, not only for loud moments that become headlines, but for quiet ones that almost never do. These are the moments where a single decision can turn a calm transit into a serious international problem. Launch aircraft too soon, and it looks like escalation. Use active sonar too aggressively, and it looks like a direct challenge. Ignore the contact completely, and risk begins to grow in silence. So the strike group did what experienced naval forces do best. It waited. Above the surface, the night remained calm. Watch teams continued their routines. The carrier moved on through the dark water. But beneath it, something unseen was testing boundaries, measuring reactions, and studying behavior. The most tense part of an encounter at sea is not always the moment when action happens. Sometimes it is the long stretch when nothing happens at all. Somewhere beneath the Caribbean, a Venezuelan submarine was about to discover how much silence the U.S. Navy was willing to tolerate. By 3:29 a.m., the contact had settled into a clearer pattern. In the sonar control space, analysts overlaid the track history against the movement of the carrier strike group. The result was difficult to dismiss. Each minor adjustment by the USS George Washington appeared to be mirrored after a short delay, corrected by small degrees and refined with quiet precision. This was not drift. This was shadowing. The contact held a consistent depth just below the thermocline, a layer of water where temperature shifts can bend sound and complicate detection. That was a smart choice. Whoever was controlling the submarine understood the environment and knew how to use it. The U.S. response remained measured. Passive sonar continued to carry the burden. No unnecessary emissions. No sudden signals. No public posture change. The first objective was not confrontation. It was clarity. And clarity in the undersea domain comes from patience. The contact's acoustic signature remained faint but stable. It had a low-frequency character, carefully managed and without the kinds of uncontrolled noise that would suggest poor maintenance or inexperience. This was not a forgotten relic struggling through the water. It appeared to be a maintained platform handled by people who understood pressure. Every few minutes, the sonar team marked tiny changes. A small bearing correction, a slight depth adjustment, a quiet attempt to maintain alignment with the carrier's movement. Not close enough to force a response, not far enough to disappear. In undersea operations, that choice says a great deal. A submarine that wants to avoid attention usually breaks away. A submarine that intends to force a crisis behaves very differently. But a submarine that wants to watch, learn, and measure response times does exactly this. It stays near the edge. It gathers information. It leaves room for denial. Inside the carrier's operations center, quiet simulations began running. If the contact continued along its current path, it would soon reach the outer edge of a much more sensitive defensive zone. Still not necessarily unlawful, still not automatically a crisis, but close enough to compress decision-making time for everyone involved. Above decks, nothing appeared to change. Aircraft remained parked. Flight operations stayed dark. From a distance, the strike group might have looked almost asleep. It was not. Escort ships made tiny adjustments in spacing, changes so small they would barely register to a casual observer. But underwater, those small movements mattered. They reshaped the acoustic environment and changed the geometry around the contact. Professional naval pressure often looks like nothing from the surface. Beneath the water, it can change everything. The unknown submarine reacted. Its track bent slightly, adjusting to preserve its relative position. That response confirmed what the watch teams needed to know. This was interactions. Not coincidence. Still, no general alarm was sounded. The rules were clear. Presence alone does not justify a dramatic response. And once escalation begins at sea, reversing it can be difficult. So the response remained disciplined. Everything was recorded. Timestamps, bearing changes, acoustic variations, every small detail. Because modern maritime encounters do not end when the contact leaves. They continue in the data. What is collected in the moment can matter later in diplomatic, legal, and strategic conversations. At 3:41 a.m., the contact made its first meaningful change. It slowed. Not by much, but enough to alter the closing rate. That mattered. A submarine slowing while maintaining shadowing behavior usually suggests one of two things: energy conservation or hesitation. In either case, it reveals limits. A diesel-electric submarine running quietly on battery power is trading endurance for concealment. Every minute under the surface becomes part of a countdown. The commander below was making choices now, balancing proximity against risk. On the carrier, the command team recognized the window. Not a window for dramatic action, but for positioning. If the submarine wanted to remain hard to identify, it would need to either withdraw or accept rising exposure. If it wanted to move closer, it would eventually have to reveal something: speed, depth, noise, or intent. The U.S. Navy did not force the choice immediately. It allowed silence to do the work. Silence can be pressure. Used correctly, it makes the other side decide first. It reveals discipline, patience, or the lack of both. Below the surface, the contact stayed controlled and persistent. But the ocean is unforgiving. The closer any submarine gets to a carrier strike group, the smaller its margin becomes. Every layer of defense reduces options. Every mile changes the calculation. And somewhere under the Caribbean Sea, the shadow was beginning to run out of room. By 3:56 a.m., the geometry had tightened. The contact was no longer sitting at the edge of uncertainty. Its path now placed it in a zone where every additional mile reduced the time available for response. In a carrier strike group, distance is not just distance. Distance is time, and time is survival. On board USS George Washington, the command team reviewed the updated picture without unnecessary discussion. The data was clear enough. The submarine had not committed to a direct confrontation. It had committed to proximity. That difference mattered. In U.S. Navy procedure, intent is not guessed. It is demonstrated. So far, the contact had demonstrated discipline, control, and restraint. In the undersea domain, those are not comforting qualities. They are serious ones. Passive sonar remained central. The contact's signature stayed tight and carefully managed. No erratic moves, no careless noise, no obvious mistake. Whoever was beneath the surface understood that one loss of acoustic discipline could change the entire situation. But discipline cuts both ways. The strike group continued reshaping the battle space quietly. Escort ships shifted course by small degrees. Visually, the changes were almost invisible. Underwater, they adjusted the acoustic picture around the contact. Bearings tightened, baselines changed. The invisible net became more defined. Not fast, not loud, not emotional, deliberate. The submarine responded with another small correction, a slight depth change, a subtle bearing adjustment, enough to maintain alignment. That response confirmed awareness. This was not a lost boat. It was not an accidental approach. The crew knew where they were and what they were moving near. At this distance, every option carried consequences. If the U.S. Navy used active sonar, the contact would be clearly defined and the quiet ambiguity would end. If a helicopter launched too soon, the signal would be unmistakable. If nothing happened, the submarine might continue testing the margin until the situation became far less forgiving. This was the narrowest part of the encounter. In modern maritime competition, escalation does not always begin with obvious action. It begins with signals, posture, movement, and the question of who forces the other side to adjust first. The U.S. Navy does not make that choice lightly. Inside the operations center, commanders authorized a preparatory shift. Not an outward display, but an inward one. Undersea response teams moved from observation to readiness. Aircraft crews were alerted, but not launched. Sensors were aligned, but not fully revealed. Everything was prepared. Nothing unnecessary was shown. That is what restraint looks like when it is backed by capability. The submarine, still quiet, began to feel the pressure through geometry rather than sound. The water around it was no longer empty space. It was structured, layered, watched. At 4:07 a.m., the contact slowed again. This time the reduction was more noticeable. That change mattered even more. Slowing at that distance suggested battery preservation was becoming a real factor. It also suggested the commander below was reassessing the risk. Long shadowing was no longer cost-free. Every additional minute increased the chance that more of the submarine's behavior would be mapped and stored for later analysis. The U.S. Navy saw the hesitation and did not rush to exploit it. Instead, the strike group held course, held speed, and held silence. That choice forced the submarine to decide. Withdraw and keep deniability. Press closer and reveal more. There was no comfortable third option. Under the sea, shadows only exist where light has not reached. And the deeper that submarine moved into the carrier's defensive structure, the brighter the invisible spotlight became. This was no longer a test of strength. It was a test of nerve. And beneath the Caribbean, the submarine commander was beginning to learn that silence alone was no longer enough. At 4:14 a.m., the contact broke its own pattern. It was not dramatic. It was not loud in the way a surface observer would understand. But underwater, small deviations can carry enormous meaning. Inside the sonar space, one operator leaned forward as a new trace appeared. Brief, imperfect, and unmistakable. A transient acoustic spike. Not a launch. Not an aggressive move. Just a momentary loss of silence. But after nearly an hour of careful behavior, that single sound was enough. The room did not react with excitement. It reacted with precision. On board USS George Washington, commanders authorized a calibrated response. The purpose was not to provoke. It was to confirm. Active sonar was permitted once. A short, narrow, controlled pulse. The ocean answered immediately. The contact's position sharpened from uncertainty into a defined picture. Bearing, depth, and shape. The ambiguity that had protected the submarine faded in seconds. The U.S. Navy now knew exactly where it was. More importantly, the submarine knew that the U.S. Navy knew. That realization changed the encounter. Almost immediately, the contact adjusted depth, dropping just enough to leave the acoustic layer it had been using. It was a defensive move and a smart one, but it came too late to erase what had already been confirmed. The response expanded, not through noise, but through presence. An MH-60 Seahawk helicopter lifted from the deck of an escort ship, its rotors cutting through the night air just above the horizon. No unnecessary lights, no dramatic radio traffic, just a dark shape moving into position. To civilians, a helicopter launch might look like a major moment. In naval operations, it can be a carefully measured signal. It says something without words. We see you. We are here. You are not moving unnoticed. From the submarine's perspective, the calculation had changed completely. Helicopters compress time. They reduce room for maneuver. With specialized sensors available, the underwater space becomes smaller, faster, and much less forgiving. The contact hesitated. Then it turned. The bearing shifted away from the strike group slowly at first, carefully, as though testing whether the response would intensify. It did not. The Seahawk held position. The strike group maintained course. The message had been delivered without spectacle. As the submarine continued to turn away, analysts watched its speed increase slightly. That was another subtle tell. Battery power was now being spent to create separation. The priority had changed from observation to departure. Within minutes, the contact was opening distance. No public warning was broadcast. No dramatic display followed. The submarine slipped back toward deeper water, its signature becoming fainter as it moved away from the carrier's defensive geometry. It was not chased. It was not harassed. It was simply allowed to leave. That, too, was deliberate. In encounters like this, the goal is not embarrassment. It is quiet dominance, demonstrated clearly enough that the other side understands the message without forcing a wider crisis. By 4:29 a.m., the contact was outside the most sensitive zone. It was still detectable, still tracked, but no longer an immediate factor. The Seahawk returned to its ship. Active sonar was secured. The strike group eased back into its original posture as if nothing unusual had happened. Above the surface, the night still looked calm. Anyone watching from far away would have seen no sign of what had unfolded beneath the water. But beneath that calm, the result was clear. The Venezuelan submarine had come close enough to test boundaries, close enough to gather data, close enough to believe that silence might protect it. Instead, it learned something more important. It learned how quickly silence can be stripped away. It learned how little room exists near a carrier strike group. And it learned how the U.S. Navy can end a tense encounter without turning it into a public spectacle. The most decisive moments at sea are rarely the loudest ones. Often they are quiet. And when this one ended, only one side moved away, knowing it had been tracked, understood, and outmatched. By dawn, the Caribbean looked unchanged. The sea was flat. The air was still. The carrier strike group continued its transit as if the night had passed without anything unusual. No alerts for the public, no immediate statements, no visible sign of confrontation. That was part of the design. On board USS George Washington, the encounter had already moved from operations into analysis. Sonar logs were secured, acoustic details were cataloged. Timestamps from different platforms were aligned. Every bearing change, every depth adjustment, every hesitation became part of a larger record. In modern naval competition, data is power. The Venezuelan submarine had not crossed a clear legal line. From a narrow legal perspective, it could be described as routine presence in international waters. But strategically, the picture was sharper. This was a gray zone probe, a deliberate attempt to operate just below the threshold that would require a stronger response. Close enough to observe, quiet enough to deny intent, bold enough to send a message without creating a public crisis. That message was received, but another message was sent back, and the submarine's crew would carry it home. They learned that proximity cuts both ways. Silence becomes fragile when layered defenses begin to shape the space around it. A carrier strike group does not need to chase in order to dominate the encounter. It only needs to understand, position, and wait. The U.S. Navy's response was not built around embarrassment or provocation. It was built around clarity. It showed that restraint can guide action, while awareness controls everything else. No one celebrated. Professional crews usually do not. The absence of escalation is not a victory lap. It is confirmation that procedure worked. Had the submarine pushed closer, the response would have tightened. Had it revealed more noise, the situation would have moved faster. Had the U.S. Navy reacted emotionally instead of methodically, the quiet shadowing could have become a much more serious standoff within minutes. Instead, both sides were forced to face reality. For Venezuela, the reality was simple. Shadowing a carrier strike group is not just a symbolic gesture. It is an exercise at the edge of exposure. Every mile closer gives less in return. Every minute nearby increases the chance of being mapped, studied, and understood. For the United States, the lesson was equally clear. Presence alone is not deterrence. Discipline is. The ability to observe without overreacting, to wait without giving ground, and to apply pressure without unnecessary force remains one of the Navy's strongest tools. This encounter did not end with headlines. It ended with separation. And that separation said more than any public statement could. The submarine returned toward deeper water, carrying more than acoustic information. It carried a new understanding of how quickly the balance can shift when silence meets structure, and when intent meets preparation. Moments like this rarely make the news. They do not produce dramatic images, loud recordings, or viral clips. But they define the modern maritime environment all the same. Because today's naval competition is not always about who acts first. It is about who controls the moment when neither side does. The Caribbean will likely see more encounters like this. Different platforms, different flags, the same careful calculations, subtle pressure, measured responses, lines tested but not crossed. The night a Venezuelan submarine moved toward a U.S. aircraft carrier ended without a public crisis, but it did not end without consequence. At sea, silence is never empty. Sometimes it carries the loudest message of all.